Good morning and welcome to another Journey with Christ. We are so glad you've joined us today as we continue in our studies as it relates to our lives here on this earth, but as they relate to the life that we're living in Jesus and with Jesus. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm the preaching minister at the Park Avenue Church of Christ here in Charleston, West Virginia. I am joined as always by my able-bodied sidekick and mentor and teacher, Steve Fox, a minister for over 50 years in the Kanawha Valley. Man, I don't get tired of saying that. I don't know about you.
Am I all those things that you just said?
Mentor and sidekick, yeah.
Wow. Well, we've come a long way then, because when we first going to start this program, we were going to have Larry, Curly, and Mo teach the book of Revelation, which may be pretty close to what we're going to be doing in the next few weeks.
Yeah. And we're anxious to show you our new setup here of having the TV up and using it as a illustration, slide presentation periodically. And also as an outline to keep Steve and I in line.
Or keep me to my time limit, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
We are going to make these in smaller, shorter segments. It may take longer, but we're going to do that simply because it's hard to do something for more than 30 minutes. But you know, you and I are going to have to rein in the ad-lib a little bit.
Well, I'll make sure I keep you controlled. Okay?
Keep me under control, please. I have a tendency every now and then to wander off. Not like anybody else I know, but anyway. Well,
we're just stammering around a little bit because neither one of us want to attack this topic that we're going to be. No, I'm teasing. But the next few weeks, we don't know how long, but the next few weeks we're going to study the book of Revelation. I want you to know right from the beginning that was Mark's idea. That was not my idea. It's kind of like saying to a kid, I know you haven't had arithmetic, but let me teach you calculus. So we're starting with Revelation when there are all kinds of other things in the New Testament we could be studying that are a little bit easier. But it'll be a challenge for us. And I hope what we accomplish is that Mark and I show you things, or at least read things that remind you of things that you already know about this book. A lot of people are scared of this book.
Yeah.
They're scared because they don't know where all these beasts are coming from, beasts out of the sea, beasts off the land. It's a book about war, really, about who's going to win the war. And Jesus ends up being the conquering king, and he's the one who wins the war. So the message of the book is, if you want to be on the right side, you be on the one who's riding on this white horse.
You know, probably the biggest thing that creates a huge problem with the book of Revelation is the fact that it is all of this prose and all these illustrations that make no sense to us, and then people try to make things out of that, which then creates nothing but confusion, because as we're going to talk about earlier, this book isn't necessarily written to us in that purpose.
And that confusion comes when we take a verse and say, well, that's the 20th century or the 21st century, when there is another possibility, and the book opens with that possibility, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. The way I look at, I've told Mark this, the way I look at the topic that the two of us have chosen, we're not real sure why we did it, but we both kind of feel like a lost ball in high weeds.
Which I'm used to dealing with. I'm a golfer.
Oh, I thought you meant because you lived in Lincoln County.
Well, no.
No, okay.
A golfer finding a lost ball in high weeds.
It's a good feeling, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I love it when it happens.
So we're going to go slow, but at least fast enough that we won't get drugged down in not only chapter by chapter, we won't go word by word, we promise that. And we're not going to try to explain to you what the second toe on the third beast that came out of the sea was, because basically people in our century don't know what those things are, and there's a reason for that. This book is called Revelation. Now, it's rather ironic that this book is called Revelation because it doesn't reveal a lot of things to us that we understand and we know. And the reason for that is it was addressed, and I'll let Mark address this a little bit. The reason that's so is because it was addressed by Jesus. He wrote the letters, according to chapter 1. He wrote the letters, and he sent them to 7 different churches in Asia Minor. Now, that means, as Mark will explain to you in a minute, that means that those books, those letters were written to 7 specific churches, and that was their original content and their original purpose. None of those letters were written to us.
No.
None of those letters were written to Park Avenue or Kanawha City or Elkview. None of those letters were written to specific churches in our day and time. But they can give us all kinds of wisdom. It can give us all kinds of topics that we need to be studying if we want to be what we should be in the kingdom of God. And if all you have to do is look at the other letters in the New Testament, Paul didn't write 1st and 2nd Corinthians to the Park Avenue church.
No.
He wrote it to the church at Corinth. Now, does that mean we can't learn anything from it? It means exactly the opposite. Those people, there was an original thing that Paul was trying to tell them when he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There's an original thing that Jesus is trying to tell these 7 churches when they write the seven letters to the 7 churches. That is that there are things that you need to know. And back then, what's the proper way to do it? Send a letter.
Yeah.
You don't get on Facebook or all that other stuff you guys play on all the time.
Well, you can't even get on TV, or you can't even use a magazine, a newspaper, anything. You have a letter that would have been given and passed out and passed around because, ironically, John is writing this in one context, compiled together to 7, it was written to 7 different churches, but compiled together. Because he doesn't stop at chapter 1 and say, okay, I'm going to send these 7 letters out, and then I'll get back to write this.
And he wasn't going to send it by FedEx.
No. So he was going to send, all 7 churches read the same letter.
That's correct.
All of them written to Smyrna, Ephesus, Colossae, all of these churches. I didn't mean to say Colossae because it's not in there. But all of these churches would have read each other's letter and would have given it to all the churches at that time, because the circumstance that was going to be happening was not just going to be happening to these 7 churches, even though Jesus uses them in this format to get illustrations out and encompassing all understandings. But it was written for all of them, for them at that time, not for necessarily for us today.
And part of that confusion comes from a lot of us saying, well, I don't understand this, so I'm not going to read it.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew a lady in Mansfield, Ohio that said she couldn't read it at night because it scared her. Well, people look at it in different ways and they interpret it in different ways. But part of that confusion comes when we just kind of throw up our hands and say, well, we can't learn anything about that. We don't know anything about that. We don't know anything about the background. I was helping at a booth for a church at the Kanawha County Fair, which most of you probably don't even remember having, but it was always held at Camp Virgil Tate. And our church had rented a booth, and we were passing out New Testaments. And this guy came up to me and he said, are those free? I said, yeah, you can take a couple if you want. And he picked up a couple of the New Testaments and he said, you know what my favorite book in the Bible is? And I said, what? And he said, 2nd Ephesians. And I went, 2nd Ephesians? And the first thing that went through my mind is, well, I got somebody here who doesn't know very much about the Bible, so we'll just take it easy with him, be very gentle with him. And he said, do you enjoy reading that book? And I said, well, sir, I don't think there is a second Ephesians. Well, he takes the Bible that he had picked up and turned in Revelation to where the 7 churches were addressed. And he said, right here, second Ephesians.
Yeah.
And it is. It's the second book written to the Ephesian church.
Second letter to the church.
So I had to kind of crawl under the table for a little bit and hope nobody saw me. But things like that, I had never thought about that before. Now, today, I know that there's a second Ephesians in the Bible. It's in Revelation. Mm-hmm. So if we look for things like that, if we just say to God, help me understand more today than I understood yesterday. I'll tell you what gets us in trouble lots of times. And I'm going to apologize to this man before I show you this. His name is Stephen Williams, and this is from Christianity Today, the last issue of Christianity Today. And he has a full-page advertisement advertising a book that he wrote called The Revelation Mysteries. Now, a lot of people in the world have written a book that maybe didn't have that title, but it was about mysteries of the Revelation. Things that were mysterious, things that you couldn't figure out, things that maybe even the first century people had a hard time figuring out. Mm-hmm. Those are mysteries of the Revelation. And he writes in here a couple things, try to entice you to buy the book. He's got things about creation and the existence of God, the origins of God, the fall of Satan, what's going to happen at the last times. You can find this kind of advertisement in any library, mm-hmm. in any book stand along the concrete sidewalk. You can find hundreds of books exactly like this. And the reason that is I found the secret. And you don't know it. But I'm going to explain to you what those secrets are, what those mysteries are. And then we'll both be on the same page. We'll both be much more intelligent than we ever were. The only problem is the guys who write stuff like this, and Stephen Williams may be the finest Christian gentleman that ever lived.
That's right. Well intended.
Very well intended. But a lot of people, usually men, I haven't seen too many books about prophecy that women wrote, but mm-hmm. usually men start out with the idea, nobody understood this until I got a hold of it. Now I understand it, and now let me explain it to you.
Yeah, let me help you out.
And the problem is there are all kinds of interpretations and all kinds of views on what those topics mean. And with our new high-tech,
yes,
that Mark put together,
we're going to take a look at, I guess you've laid out for us 3 views.
3.
All right. Preterist, historical, and futurist. So won't you go ahead and tell us what you mean by these 3 views?
Okay. There are 3 ideas, 3 views, 3 interpretations of the book of Revelation, basically. Now there are subdivisions and categories under each one of those. Like under the last one, futurist, you might have 10 different churches who now believe in the futurist interpretation of Revelation, and there will also be some subsets under there, some other ideas under there. So somebody who believes one of these things doesn't necessarily agree with everybody else who agrees with the same thing. We'll start with preterist. It's a Greek word that means past. And there are scholars who, and I've read the books, if you want to come in my library and read them, I'll let you do that. The preterist interpretation of Revelation is that the entire book is written to a group of 7 churches because we're in the middle of a war and Jesus is going to win that war. And the preterist interpretation says everything in the book of Revelation happened in the 1st century. Mm-hmm. It means past. Preterist tense in English, it means past.
Already happened.
It already happened. So I grew up in a preterist church, so I either try to get verses that explain that's not true, or get verses that reinforce that view, mm-hmm. whichever you want to do. But I grew up in a preterist church, and so that's what I was taught most of the time. I know some wonderful, wonderful people who believe that. Some of my brethren won't extend an invitation or extend any sympathy to people who believe that. But that's the first one. The second view is historical, not hysterical, historical. And what that means is there are people who have read this book, and what they see is kind of a schedule that goes from the first century when Jesus was here to hitting every historical thing that happened in the religious world up till the end of time, or what we would call the end of the world. So if you look here, here's Jesus and his apostles, and here's a graph that comes all the way out, and different things will happen historically, and that's what John is writing his letter about.
Sort of a futurist, but...
It's kind of a futurist, but it also goes way back to Jesus.
It's linear in its process. It's not going to all happen at once.
Exactly.
This is a layout of what's going to happen.
The first one is going to happen in the first century in 40 years.
Yeah.
The second one, historically, it takes place, like you said on that graph.
Till the end of time.
Yes.
Futurist is...
And a futurist is somebody who reads the book and says, none of this has happened yet.
And it's all in...
And it's all in our...
When the cards are laid just right, this is when it's
everything is going to be in our future from this point on to whenever that is. Of course, people have been saying that about the futurist view since...
80, 60...
There are a lot of futurists who are alive right now, who would tell you, who would believe very sincerely that everything in this book, all 22 chapters in this book, are it hasn't happened yet, or in our future. It's in our future. And to give you an example, we have amillennialists who believe that 1,000-year reign is just a symbol, and there's not going to necessarily be a 1,000-year reign. And we have people who read the book and say, well, it's obvious. There are verses that say Jesus is going to return. He's going to come back, and he's going to rebuild his kingdom, and he's going to reign on the earth with his people for 1,000 years. That obviously hasn't happened. If I can throw a personal comment in here, if that's what's going to happen, I don't care where it happens. All these people that argue about where it's going to be, new heavens, new earth, is it going to be in the United States? Is it going to be in Europe? I don't particularly care.
No.
I'd like to be there.
I just don't want to get left out.
Yeah. So a futurist reads the book and says, this makes sense to me when I put it in the prospect and in the context of future events. There are amillennialists who believe that there's not going to be a literal 1,000-year reign. There are post-millennialists who believe that will happen after Jesus returns. There are premillennialists, which is probably
the greater majority
of people in the Christian world would teach you that. If you want to know what that is, go get a Scofield Bible, because he wrote the whole thing from a futurist view, from a premillennial view. So every person that's worth their salt, worth anything. I mean, if you're a preacher and you go to a church interview for a job, you better know something about Revelation.
You better.
Because they're going to ask you.
They better have a view on Revelation. Of course, I'll be honest with you. And you and I have had this discussion, and I've had it with many people as it pertains to understanding of Jesus Christ. They'll ask me, well, what do you think? And I always kind of preface it like this. I said, I've yet to find really important, there are good things in here to study, but the problem of having a discussion is it always leads to divisive paths. And
if you want to start a big argument, go to a preacher's breakfast and go around a table and ask them which one of these three do they adhere to, and then get out of the way.
Yeah, because
now
it's not going to go well.
What I have learned in my own individual life, and I'm not trying to make myself look superior here, but what I've learned in my individual life is it doesn't make any difference which one of those three is going to happen.
No.
Now, I think the compass leads towards one, and I already told you about that. But if there are going to be questions on Revelation when we get to heaven, we're all in trouble.
We're all in trouble
because nobody has, no book, no person, no conference, no seminar has the idea that, okay, here it is, here's the mystery, we're going to open up that mystery for you.
Well, and the truth of it is, a lot of the answers that give us basis for where we are in our thinking on this are actually in the first few chapters.
Very, very much so.
In fact, we need to go ahead and hit there.
Before we look at the first paragraph, which is a great place to start, chapter 1, verse 1.
Absolutely.
Let me mention a couple other things that Mark and I have talked about that we need to look at. Those three interpretations that we looked at, preterist, historical, and futurist. The book is called Revelation, which means it's going to reveal something. Whereas in the 21st century, what happens is we read this book and it doesn't reveal anything to us because we're confused and we don't know what's going on historically at that time along in the chronology. So it's supposed to be a book of revealing. That's what the word means. You can see the word reveal in there.
Yep.
It was revealing things to people who lived in the first century. These letters were written to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, churches that were in the first century. Now, how's that book going to reveal to the people in the first century and maybe not reveal things to us in the 21st century? Well, the closest thing I can use to answer that question is, have you ever read the parables of Jesus? Most of us have. And I think I don't think anybody would argue with me here. The parables of Jesus are a little bit easier to understand and comprehend and make some lessons from than Revelation is.
Oh, without doubt.
Here's the problem we have with the parables of Jesus. You go to a church and the minister preaches a wonderful sermon about the prodigal son or the good Samaritan, or preaches a sermon about the kinds of soil that's in your heart. Mm. Now, what happens in most churches is we read that parable in our adult Bible class, and then we take 15 minutes or 20 minutes to talk about what that means to us. What lessons can I learn from that? What lessons did I learn from reading this parable? And then after we ask that question, we realize, well, if we got enough time, maybe we can go back and see what it meant to the original hearers.
Yeah, what
did they get out of it? Well, guess what? They're the ones who heard it first. They're the one, and we do it exactly the opposite. We should not figure out what it means to us and then try to figure out what it meant to people in the first century when Jesus told them. Instead, we ought to try that first, see what this originally meant to the people who first heard it, well, and then add to our belief things that we can learn from it ourselves.
A lot of people think Jesus is just like us preachers. We tell a story, and we have a point to our story.
Sometimes.
But Jesus knew the point of his story at the beginning of the telling, and there was something he wanted these people, the people that were in front of him, to see, hear, and understand, or as Jesus tells sometimes in these parables, nobody's going to understand, but you're going to understand later. Mm-hmm. Some of them are to confuse you, to make you ask. So, to say that we grasp everything in today's understanding, we miss a lot.
And to study that idea, go through the parables of Jesus, and that may be a good series for us in 5 years when we get done with the book of Revelation. But if you start reading the parables of Jesus, you're going to find out that he was correcting people. He saw something that wasn't right, and then he started correcting those things, and he did it by using the parables.
Yeah, telling a story.
Yeah. And the best way to study the parables is when you get done looking at that parable, say, who am I in that parable?
Yeah.
Which one am I? Because we're all in there.
Yeah. We're somebody in that story.
Yeah. Another thing that is important about the book of Revelation, besides what it reveals and the way to interpret it similar to the way we interpret parables, is to understand these three views that we put up on the screen a minute ago. And to whom was it written? Who's the audience here? We get in a lot of trouble when we think it's us.
Mm-hmm.
Because these 7 churches, as we've already maintained, these 7 churches received those 7 letters, and then they probably went to other churches, or at least the ideas went to other churches that were existing in the first century. Now, you and I, and we're going to talk about this next week, you and I can pick up chapter 2 and 3 of Revelation and read the 7 letters that were originally written to those 7 churches.
Mm-hmm.
That does not mean they were written to us. That means that they were, the original audience was those people that received those letters. And yes, we can learn from those things. Mm-hmm. We can learn from all 7 of those letters about all kinds of different things that maybe we have the same problem with that they had in the first century. So that was the audience. Now, the date. When was this book written? I hate to tell you that the vast majority of New Testament scholars, and that does not involve me or Mark, the vast majority of New Testament scholars put a later date on this book, 90, 95, some of them as late as 101. The other option and the other possibility is it was written in the late 50s or the early 60s. Now, there are, in my opinion, there are good ideas on both sides, and I've read all of them. I've read all the debates and all the books that say, well, this is the way it happened, and then other books say, no, this isn't the way it happened. So if you start looking at the audience and you start looking at the date, it's either 68 or 95. Now, obviously, the people who are preterists that we talked about before say it was written before Jerusalem was destroyed. Mm-hmm. And the people after that, who are either futurists or historical people, would tell you, no, it's not happened at all. It's going to happen in your future, or it's going to happen probably after most of us die. So 68 or 95. What I love about these questions is Susie and I used to read to each other in the car. I get car sick, but we used to read to each other in the car when we were on long trips. And she would read a couple verses, and then I was supposed to tell her where that was and what went before and what went afterwards. It was a little difficult, but it sure helped your knowledge of the Bible.
Yeah.
And killed some time, too, because most of the time we were driving to Nashville. But we would be reading something, and then Susie would just stop, and she'd say, now what is it you believe about that? She'd say, I know it got you in trouble a couple of times, but what is it that you believed about that? And then we have those conversations. Well, here's a group of people, 7 churches, who are receiving ideas and topics from Jesus himself, from the Holy Spirit that wrote those letters. And the theme of that book is, they didn't have to say, what is it we believe about this, because it was going to happen in the first century. Mm-hmm. The theme of the book is that Judaism was passing away, and that Rome was passing away, but the reign of Jesus was going to be eternal. If you put all 22 chapters together, that's the idea that you have. Judaism is passing away, Rome is passing away, but the reign of Jesus is eternal. So these people are going to go after you. These people in the first century are going to go after you. Many people are going to be killed because of their belief in Christ and how they honor him as the only king. A lot of people are going to go through that part of the first century, but they believe certain things, and they believe most of all that the reign of Jesus was eternal, and that's what they understood when they read this book. I would suggest to you that if you never thought of the idea that these are letters written to churches in the first century, to read chapters 1, 2, and 3 and see how apparent it is that Jesus was talking to people who are still alive in the first century.
Yeah, and definitely wanted to keep that part of it in mind. And I've also heard it explained too, and you and I talked about this in pre-production, the fact that there is a battle going on in our world. And too often, we don't necessarily see it. A lot of times, we look at the characters that we can see and automatically assume that's where the battle is. But in truth, as the book of Revelation is going to reveal, one of these truths is that what's going on behind the scenes is where God's battle is. This is where He, and not that we're not part of the issue, but it's also these powers and rulers and authorities of this dark world that are manipulating people inside the conflict, and who produce results that are counter to what God is intending.
And as an example of that, there are all kinds of things in Revelation that people just have 50 ideas or 100 ideas about what they are. And the reason we don't understand some of those things is because we're separated by 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And we're separated by materials. We read through the 7 letters and go, what's that? What's that?
Yeah.
We may not understand it, but the people in the first century, the people who were members of those 7 churches, they understood it perfectly because Jesus was writing that to reveal those things, not to hide them. No. People today approach Revelation and say, oh, there's a bunch of hidden stuff.
There's a secret thing here.
Yeah, there's a secret thing here that only a few people look at the order of that book and find out what those secret things are.
These great insights now that you've got that nobody else has ever had. All of a sudden now, this letter was written to him.
And an example of that is, and probably the one thing that's talked about more in Revelation than anything else, is 666.
Oh, yeah.
666.
Well, we'll save that. Let's save that for another day.
I just want to use that as an example.
Yeah.
We may not understand 666, but the people in the first century put the jigsaw pieces together.
They got the clue.
They knew who 666 was.
Yep.
They knew who the enemy was.
Yeah.
And in some way, we got to put that stuff in the back of our mind and think about that a little bit and say, how was this addressed in the first century, and how does it affect me?
Yeah. Well, you want to do our prologue? We're almost out of time.
Yes.
All right.
We'll do that. We'll take a shot at that.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to be real, well, not that I'm always serious, but I want to be real serious about what changed my mind about this entire scope of this book. And I didn't see it for a long time. Maybe I wasn't looking. Maybe when people were teaching it, I was asleep or something. Mm-hmm. But here is the primary thing that we need to know about Revelation. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants what must soon take place. And he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Blessed is he who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear, who keep what is written therein, for the time is near. I want you to notice 2 things. In the first verse, these are about things that must soon take place.
Yeah.
Now, which one of those 3 does that sound like? You don't have to answer that, but which one of those 3 does that sound like? And then he says at the last part of that paragraph, keep what's written therein, for the time is near. So we got 2 places in the first 3 verses where John the Revelator, who was on the Isle of Patmos and who was listening to this prophecy, we have 2 passages. One says they will soon take place, the things of this history will soon take place, and the time is at hand. You have to look at content. You have to look at context. See, I could read this to you and say, you know what? In the next week, Jesus is going to return, and he's going to set up his kingdom and rule in the world for 1,000 years. I don't believe that, but
I could say it.
I'll tell you what, if they go in there and start to rebuild that temple, I might change my mind about some things. Here's what he says. This is what he wants them to know through chronology. They will soon take place, and the time is near. What we're going to try to do in the next few weeks, Mark and I both have committed to this. What we're going to try to do is when we interpret something, or we look at something, or we study something, or ask somebody else to study it with us, we put it in the context of, for they must soon take place, and the time is near. He says the person is blessed who reads the words of the prophecy. And the person is blessed who hears the words of the prophecy.
Yeah.
Who keep what's written.
And you know, the other thing to keep in mind, and I've heard people argue their other viewpoints about this. Well, he says part of it is, part of it isn't, you know. But given the way all the books of the New Testament are written, they follow a pattern. They give, as this one, an introduction, a prologue. Why am I writing this letter? This is why I'm writing this letter. This is why I'm telling you this. And they would not have picked up and said part of this is the words of the prophecy. They would have said all of this is the words of the prophecy, which then said, blessed are those who hear it and take it to heart, what is written in it, because the time is near.
And when you first read that letter,
you just can't pull and pick.
Well, he says that very clearly in the last couple chapters. He says you can't add anything to this letter.
Take it away.
And you can't take anything away.
Yeah.
Because these are the words of God. So I'm not supposed to fool around with the words of God. Those are his words, and I'm supposed to
absolutely
accept it all and make sure I don't remove any of it.
Yeah. So, you know, this is I don't think this book has to be difficult. I think too often we try to make it difficult. We try to see things into it that's maybe not necessarily there, or we take some of these pictures and all of a sudden create this, you know, monster, and now we want to say, okay, we created him. What does it mean? You know, and it.
And how often have you and I sat in this class with each other and said, I don't know.
I don't know.
It's okay to say I don't know about Revelation.
It's a biblical concept, I don't know. In fact, when you were talking a while ago about someone's got secret insight, I was thought of in, I forget which book, that Paul says, and I think it's 2 Corinthians, but it may not have been. He says, I received a dream. I was called up into the second heaven.
For 14 years.
And, well, no, I'm not talking about that.
You're not talking that passage?
I'm talking about the time where he said he was lifted up into a reality that he wasn't allowed to share. He says, I can't tell you. I'm not allowed to tell you. And
I'll tell you how I know Peter had read Revelation, because in 1 Peter he says, Paul and other writers are writing some stuff that we don't understand. We're in pretty good company when we don't understand some things.
When we don't understand it. But you and I both know that revelations comes, and I'm speaking of personal revelations, come as the Spirit works in our lives. Because there are times we are given things that is just, the timing on them is perfect.
Mm-hmm. And the great thing about that is we usually don't control those things.
We don't control the history. And
He's in control.
That's right.
And man, that's hard to accept sometimes.
Well, that's the great thing about the book of Revelations. That's one of those underlying things is Jesus says, I'm the ruler here.
And please remember, it's revealing something. It's not trying to hide something.
Yeah.
There are no mysteries to the people in the first century. They understood who the sea beast was, who the land beast was. They understood who 666 was. We may go through there and stumble and fall flat on our face, but those people in the first century knew what he was talking about.
They had historical context on all this stuff.
Yes.
So, yeah. Well, listen, we are so glad you have joined us. We hope, as we go along, we will not leave you questioning our abilities or what can be understood. We're just going to look at this, read it, and go through it as best we can. And
haven't we decided we were going to take 3 verses every week?
No, we're not doing that. Next week we will catch up with a little bit of John chapter 1, but then go into the letters to the churches in Asia.
And this week, make sure you read 2nd Ephesians.
Yes. Yeah, this coming week, go ahead and read the first 3 chapters of Revelation. In fact, I heard one man say, and actually he took it out of the part of the prologue, you need to read it aloud. Mm-hmm. I don't know, oftentimes you and I read, the only thing we just read inside our head. I would encourage you to read aloud as we're going through this book of Revelation. There must be a reason for it, and it's important. Next week, we will continue our discussion, and if you have any questions,
send them to you.
Email them to me so that I can give them to Steve. And maybe hold off, write your question down, but hold off, and we'll get to it in a little bit later date when we grab a few questions and maybe every now and then do a review with the questions.
I think I'll be on vacation that week.
Yeah, I know you will, because I won't tell you the weekend it's going to be. On behalf of Steve and I, we're so glad you joined us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless, and have a great week.